Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with me, Christian Harris. Today I have the first part of my interview with Justin Strange, and I thought I'd split this conversation into two podcasts because, well, two reasons. Firstly, it's Sliptember, and I was keen to have a Sliptember themed podcast, and this first part of the interview absolutely is that. And secondly, because the second part of the interview went into lots of other different topics which actually stand on their own as a standalone episode anyway. So therefore, we have two interviews back to back with Justin. In this first interview, we focus on slip safety and in particular the Tesco case that Justin was involved in, where a man slipped, broke his hip, and it resulted eventually in Tesco getting nearly a £750,000 criminal fine after a court conviction. So we talk about that investigation, about what Justin saw, about why the decision was made to prosecute, and lots more. So you'll get a lot from this episode if you manage slip safety risks, but there are also lessons to learn generally about what leads to prosecutions and how to go about trying to be in the best possible position to prevent that from happening to you. So I hope you enjoy this episode. Do excuse me at the end if it breaks away quite abruptly. That's because, as I say, this was one single conversation. We split it into the two episodes, but I think that's the best approach. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Justin and myself about slip safety, lessons learned from a £750,000 slip. Cheers.
Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with Christian Harris. We believe that proactive safety and risk management powers business performance. Each week we explore this theme, sharing guests, stories, insights, trends, hints and tips. You can find us on all the major podcasting platforms, and video versions are available on YouTube. For now, let's join the conversation with Christian.
Welcome to the podcast, Justin. Thanks for joining me today.
No, absolute pleasure, Christian.
I co-opted you after a recent presentation I did for your IRSM branch, so I appreciate it.
Pleasure. It's always nice to get to talk about health and safety. I get stupidly animated by it.
Yeah, well, you've done a master's, haven't you, and various qualifications. So you're obviously very dedicated.
Yeah. Oddly enough, I started out as a chef. So I was a chef for about 20 years, and then my restaurant had a food poisoning outbreak, and I just couldn't believe that after taking my first day off in 6 months, come back and find an EHO in my kitchen and going, what the hell happened? And oddly enough, I knew the EHO, and he said, why don't you come over to our side? Because clearly you love food safety and that. And I said, yeah, sure. Went over, became an EHO, and then thought, it's not just enough to be an EHO. So I went and did my first year of law so I could actually prosecute in Australia. And then I did more study, and then more study, and then more study. I actually got told once to take all my training off my CV because it looked too threatening because it was about 3 pages worth of training.
Yeah.
So yeah, I absolutely love health and safety. It's my wife's also in health and safety, but it's an absolute passion that we have. It's what we talk about over dinner.
Oh, good stuff. That's nice. I don't have the same opportunity with my wife. She's less enamored with health and safety, shall we say?
Oh yeah, I think unfortunately Jennifer and I could talk for hours at length, and often do, about the bits and pieces and the legislation and the process, and we just don't get tired of it.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's good. It's nice to it's nice to have that shared passion. And how long ago did you come to the UK?
I moved back 7 years ago now. So I left after I think when I was 20 to basically do what every chef does, which is travel the world to cook, which took me from the UK to France, and then from France to New York to Hong Kong, and then to Australia, and then South Korea, and then back. And then I qualified as an EHO, and then I went and worked in Madagascar, South Africa, East Timor, with the Navy, Australia, all over, and now I'm back in the UK. So interesting. The UK is very interesting in comparison to the other countries where I've worked. So
yeah. From the perspective of legislation, or from the perspective of kind of enforcement or claims, or how would you sort of categorize that?
In all aspects, the legislation is slower to enact. Often doesn't have enough teeth. I think it's harder to enforce because it normally puts the onus on the prosecuting authority, whereas in Australia, the onus is on the business to prove that they didn't do something wrong, whereas it's the opposite way here. So the burden of proof is on the enforcement agencies, which is why I think a lot of the cases take so long to get to court. Whereas when I would initiate a prosecution in Australia, I'd probably be in court within 2 months at the most.
Wow.
And it's a lot easier. So basically, we just say, look, you don't need risk assessments, you don't need paperwork. But if it goes wrong, and it'll be a lot harder for you to prove that you didn't do it. So,
okay, yeah, it's interesting because I think that lots of people would have the perception that the UK is kind of, in many ways, leading the world in health and safety. And I suppose if you look at comparative performance across certain metrics, that I think we are. But yeah, that's an interesting sort of counter argument to that perhaps there is more we could do to improve.
I think the UK is doing very well in regards to health and safety, and that's evident by how many sites are working. I think the problem what we have is it's a little bit disjointed in how we I suppose translate that sort of legislation and needs to businesses and the community as a whole. Whereas because the HSE basically offer advice for a paid fee, whereas in Australia you have WorkSafe who basically cover the entire. So local authority doesn't really get involved in health and safety unless it's public buildings or events, whereas the WorkSafe covers everything, and they are happy to give away information as much as they can because they don't want to prosecute. But I think that's where, and local authority is a little bit harder as well because they're not sure of their advice. So a lot of the environmental health officers who do with mainly food safety also deal with health and safety, and it's not their specialty. Generally, food safety is their specialty. So it's kind of an add-on, and so they feel a little bit cautious about talking about it or giving advice. And that's especially my experience with working in local authority here. And it's not a negative, it's just it's one of those things where it's just a little bit more cautious on it. So it often gets left to businesses to seek consultants, such as businesses like yours and consultancies like where I've worked for. So it's becomes a somewhat regulatory burden in that regard. By removing regulatory burden, you create a cost by having consultants, having to do the work, and then people feel like they're safe because they've had a consultant in, and that's solved their problem. And a lot of the time it hasn't. It's just given them paperwork.
Yeah. You've got a bit of paper that isn't actually as helpful as perhaps you thought it might have been. Yeah. Well, you spoke about the time it takes to bring a prosecution into court, and one of the key reasons that I was keen to chat to you was I mentioned the talk I'd just done for your RRSM branch, which was because it's Sliptember and it's all about raising awareness, excuse me, about slips and trips. And after I did that talk, you mentioned that you've been involved in the Tesco case, which was a criminal prosecution and fine of just under £750,000 in early 2020, just before the pandemic. But to your point, you were working on that in 2017-18, weren't you, I think? Yeah.
I mean, the Tesco one, it's interesting because, as I said, in one of in the talk, Tesco at Jarman Park in Hemel Hempstead is it's a massive site. It's very busy, and oddly enough, when I took over the case, it had already been 1 year that the council had been holding it at that stage, close to 18 months, getting bits and pieces together. But there were actually two cases that were separated by a month apart. both involving the same cleaning company, both in almost the exact same spot, and both involved the same cleaning woman, which was unfortunate for her. So when I got handed over the prosecution briefs, my job was to go through everything and try to work out whether or not there was a credible defence that that would make us lose the case, or whether or not it was in the public interest to take forward the prosecution. And the second slip case, I looked at it and basically looked at the details, interviewed the woman again, and basically found that it was not Tesco's fault. It wasn't the cleaning company's fault. It was basically an overzealous cleaner who had known that previously she had, didn't clean something as well as she could have, and something slipped. Being the gentleman who broke his hip. And so we I didn't think that we meet public interest test to basically prosecute under that, because it was an error in cleaning more than an unsafe work practice. Whereas the first slip case it had been going on for a long time. So Tesco did know about the issues in regards to the condensation from their outright display fridges. They were constantly backing up and overflowing because of a design flaw in the underground drainage system. And it kind of was one of those ones where they knew that if they fixed it, and it wouldn't take much to fix, they could have solved the problem by removing a dog leg in the plumbing underneath the ground. It basically meant, though, that they would have had to shut that section of the store down for 48 hours to fix it. So instead of doing that, they just put boom socks down and hope that the problem would go away, and then put up all the yellow safety signs that we all know are horrible. And that was their defense. We mitigated the risk. But I basically said to our barristers that I believe that by putting up the signs and the boom socks, they acknowledged that there was a hazard.
Yeah.
And therefore they accepted that the hazard was continuing and ongoing, and therefore they owned that hazard. So it was basically profit over safety, in my opinion. And that was, the case in regards to it. I mean, their defense was that they had the floor slip rated. In my argument, which was, again, that's great, but if it was that good a slip rating, then how did someone fall over? The major problem that we actually had was the gentleman who actually did slip. He was the worst witness for the prosecution.
Oh, really?
Because in his victim impact statement, he basically said, and at that stage, he slipped over when he was 91, and he was 94 when I was interviewing him. And he basically went, I can't play football anymore.
Wow.
That's not going to help me. And when he got his compensation claim, because he was basically like that, and a problem with people in their 80s and 90s, they've suffered so long with injuries and ailments that those type of things are just an add-on, and they go, it's not so bad anymore.
Yeah.
So he was only compensated £12,000,
right?
Which is not very good, in the fact that basically he was going to be in pain for the rest of his life until he passed away. His mobility was limited to the point where he couldn't walk, really. But he really should have got a better compensation claim if he wasn't so blasé and nonchalant about it. If he basically said, had his daughter doing the talking, he would have got a better claim, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting on lots of levels. That just winding back then a little bit about this point that the risk was kind of ongoing. Were you aware of, and had you looked into the CoOp case in Truro, which was a few years prior? Because it's very, very similar in that it was that case was down to a broken chiller that was leaking onto the floor. The CoOp were aware of the fact. They'd called out an engineer who had fixed it, but then it started leaking again. And then it had been leaking for a period of, I think, maybe 48 hours or 72 hours or something like that. They put the sign out, and sadly somebody slipped near the sign, banged his head and died. And that was obviously prosecuted on the basis of a similar point, that actually this was a known risk and an ongoing risk. And actually, people were being exposed to that risk for an unacceptably long period of time. Had you sort of looked into that at all? Or?
Well, no, oddly enough, we didn't. What we did look at was other slip cases that had been brought against Tesco. And we looked at other sites, not only in Hemel Hempstead and the wider Dacorum borough, and found that mostly those upright display fridges that they used constantly leaked. So we looked at St Albans District Council and the Tesco sites there. They had the same model. They were using the same boom socks, constantly had out yellow safety signage. So we looked at those sites more, and also at their other cases, because it was a consistent failing. They knew those fridges, would leak all the time in summer. They knew that it was just a common practice. It's a horrible design flaw in them. They block up, they get biofilm in the drainage lines, and then they overfill. So we looked at those ones more than anything else, because it showed a demonstrable practice that they just refused to get rid of something and just go, okay, well, this is just our general practice. It leaks, we put boom socks down, and they get used. And the problem with the boom socks is they are reusable, but it depends on how long you allow them to dry out. So it's basically water absorbing gels. They can be reused and reused and reused, but they weren't given them enough time to fully dry out each time so they could actually reuse them again. So they just basically went, oh, we'll hang them up. And instead of the 48 to 72 hours to fully dry out, they were being put aside for maybe 12 to 13 hours, not fully absorbing again. So it basically would just run underneath the boom sock.
Yeah.
And yeah, similar to the Co-op in the fact that they knew across the entire fleet of fridges that there was a flaw, but to replace them all would have been far more costly.
So it was not only the fact, your thinking was that it was not only the fact that in this particular store there was a prolonged exposure to risk, but actually the fact that this was a systemic thing that sort of supported the fact that that it was worth prosecuting them, because that I think is the largest slip fine so far that I'm aware of. Co-op was 400,000. That was 733, wasn't it? So I suspect the next one's going to be probably the first one to breach 1 million. I'd have thought the next supermarket one, because the trend will be they keep going up, I guess.
I think you're right there. I think it's going to get more and more costly. Excuse me, over the time, because basically they should know better, because they've seen the others stores. It should be, all their risk assessments should be reviewed. Their floors should be reviewed. Their equipment should be. I think where you're failing to look at your equipment in general and say, hey, it doesn't work. What's a better way of doing this? Do we need to redesign our floor drainage or and tonnages, or do we just get new fridges across the entire set of sites? I think that's the problem with the Tesco one, is that it's trying to mitigate something that's already gone wrong, instead of saying, okay, well, it's not going to go away, so let's just swap them out. But that's the problem with a lot of those display fridges. I know Sainsbury's has a very similar sort of model at one stage, and they were having the same sort of problems. They have been swapped out, generally. The defrost cycles were always an issue. I think when we looked at our shopping list for the Tesco case, and it was a very large shopping list of information we wanted. And one of those questions was, why have you not swapped these out? If there's a known issue, why haven't you done it? And like I said, Jarman Park is big. I mean, it's down the road from me, actually.
I've been there a few times. Yeah, I used to work in Hemel Hempstead, so I used to pop in there occasionally. So it is a big and very busy store. Yeah. Yeah,
and so I mean, to monitor that would take a lot of staff effort, to kind of constantly just be up and down, up and down. And so what do you do? I mean, I know it's that argument of saying, okay, well, there's a risk there, and we clearly know that there's the hazard. But how much space do we actually take out, to kind of fix that problem? And then will it actually fix the problem? But again, the drainage thing, the problem with the drainage underneath is it actually was a three-way junction. So at that junction point, it would biofilm up and it would just back up into the fridges. Yeah. So, yeah.
And it's an interesting example, because, I spend my life, as you know, speaking about slip safety, and I always say to people that you should use a zonal approach. And, if you're thinking about a supermarket, using a zonal approach, you'd focus on the areas that are more likely to get wet or otherwise contaminated, which, you logically would be the entrances, the washrooms, the produce areas, perhaps, then obviously back of house areas and so on. But actually 95% of the floors, and most of these supermarkets have these highly polished terrazzo floors, which are very slippery when they're wet. But 95% of the floors you shouldn't really need to worry about, because as long as you can keep them dry and clean, then they're not going to be a slip risk. But obviously when you start to have these issues of known and frequent leaks and condensation and things like that, then all of a sudden the zones that you thought were kind of dry areas become wet areas. And then if you've got the incorrect floor and so on and so forth, it's very hard to manage that risk.
Yeah. And I think, and that's, again, the Jarman Park site, because there's two entrances from the car park, it's very hard to funnel those in through and try to collect enough people's feet, debris and water. You need to have basically carpeting massing all the way through into it from both sides, plus because you've got the trolleys coming out, which are bringing in contamination. You've got extra water. People don't wipe their feet at the front. And I think that's one of the most difficult things is yourself and myself, most likely, every time I go into a site that I come out, I thoroughly dry my feet. But most people don't. I watch them just walk in and then they have a slight slip and they don't go back and go, well, I'll dry my feet a bit more. And there's not, a lot of the time, there's no one at the front entrance monitoring that, water and contamination, build up. So basically they're waiting until it happens and then they go back and go, oh, we'll put a little yellow sign out. I mean, oddly enough, when I was with Bugler, I did a safety audit on one of my clients' hotels. Very lovely polished marbling floor, really good. Jennifer was meeting me after the audit, so she came from her audit, went there, we got a meeting in the lobby. She said, I'm on site, and she goes, but just to let you know, get someone up at the front, counter to kind of clean the floor a bit because I just slipped over. And I went, oh, okay. So oddly enough, we went and had a look at the CCTV, while the audit was still ongoing, watched it. And I think like what we were saying about safety signs, they've got a very nice safety sign, beautifully made. It blends in with the furniture. And the thing where instead of putting it in the middle where you would see it, they had it onto the left where basically you didn't notice it at all. So Jennifer came in, slipped. So, I went to the front counter and said, oh, did you record a near miss for the slip? And she went, and the girl behind the counter said, oh, no, I didn't. She said, the lady said she was fine and it was just because she was wearing high heels. And I went, well, that's not Jennifer because she never wears high heels to work. She's a safety person. So I went, when did this one happen? And she went, oh, about an hour ago. And I went, okay, so you've had 2 in an hour. No one's cleaning the floor. And I went, oh, and they went, okay. So the GM kind of said, oh, have we failed our audit? I went, yes, you have. You have failed your audit.
And one of the there's a couple of interesting things that come out of that. One is obviously the fact that near misses are just not reported. Slip near misses are nowhere near enough reported. But the other thing is that if you look at the number of serious slips in the UK, there are several 100,000 a year. But then if you divide that by the number of buildings, that means that the average building has well under one slip, serious slip per year. But yeah, there's this kind of perception often I see that, oh, well, we've only had 3 or 4 this month, so that's okay. Whereas actually you're, 3 or 4 in a year is well above what you should have on average. So there's a lot of these kind of misperception challenges that we need to try to overcome.
I agree. I mean, I think we know that slips cause, they are a good chunk of that, most of the issues that happen. I know most people don't see the near misses as important at all because it didn't happen. I know, again, I was doing another safety audit and one of the waitresses was taking a tray of hot coffee, like a whole tray, slipped. There was a safety sign there. She slipped on this, on liquid, the coffee almost went all over and she righted it just at the last second. And I watched everyone else just kind of go, oh, okay.
Yeah.
No one went and actually finished cleaning the job. No other staff member went checked that she was okay because she didn't pull. So it wasn't an issue. And then when asking people, during the interview stage of the audit, do you see that as a problem? They went, oh no, but she's okay. But she couldn't. I mean, she would have had at least, I don't know, third-degree burns from the coffee if she had fallen with it. If not, a broken ankle or worse. So I think that's it. I think near misses are not recorded enough, and I think I think the problem that we have in the industry as a whole is that near misses are the real metric that we want, but people only record the incident and they go, well, we've had one, and our KPIs are to reduce the amount of incidences. Whereas I always say your KPI should be how many near misses are recorded.
Yeah.
So you reverse it, so you want to see results over the consequences more than anything else.
Yeah. Yeah. There was an interesting study done by the HSL at, I think it was the National Gallery, and I don't have the exact data in my head right now. So what I'll do when we put the episode out, I'll include the data, a link to the data. But they set up cameras and they recorded the entrances to the National Gallery for, I think, 12 hours, and then they, watched very, very carefully the footage over and tried to record the number of incidents, potential fall incidents. And the numbers that they found were absolutely staggering, huge numbers of, near miss data that, just weren't being recorded at all. And when you extrapolated that 12 hours over the year, it was just a crazy number. And this was work I think that the gallery had asked them to help with so they could do something about it. So that was good. It wasn't a sort of enforcement type thing, but it just shows you that actually if you do set up, I mean, there are obviously AI systems and things like that now that you can start to use with CCTV, but if you do record these near misses, then the numbers really can be very, very large indeed. Just was keen to return back to something you said about the decision to prosecute or not, and I think you said, would it be in the public interest to do so? Because I guess if you're going to invest the time and effort and money into making a prosecution, then as a local authority, you've got to feel it is within the interest to do so. So when it comes to obviously the very high, forgetting slips for a second, these very high profile cases like the Smiler and so on have been where there have been, very serious injuries and obviously failings that have led to those. If we think about a slip scenario, and obviously every scenario is going to be slightly different, but if just theoretically, going back to what you said about entrances, where often water's coming in beyond the entrance, if someone were to slip and break their elbow at an entrance, that's probably not going to pass that public interest test. So would it be a case of it would have to be a more serious injury in that scenario to bring that? And then do you think that using that entrance example, there's obviously a difference there between water that's being trafficked in, albeit we know about it and perhaps we could do more about it, versus that kind of scenario of the leaking chillers? So do you think, is there a scenario where that kind of incident, if it was a serious one, like a brain injury or a death, or, could lead to a prosecution, or do you think that's less likely?
No, I think if you looked at the public interest test, I mean, we did actually have another one at Jarman Park again, where a woman was moving her trolley around and again slipped forward and broke both her wrists. When we looked at that, we looked at the CCTV, and again we basically went, was it someone trying to do the system? Because it didn't look like it was a cause of the store's failings. But I think if someone had slipped at an entrance and slipped forward, landed wrong, broke the wrists or, an elbow or something like that, I would say that would pass the public interest test, because what you're trying to prove with the public interest test is, will it enact change?
Yeah.
And that's the thing, is will it cause an industry change? And it probably would, because you say, well, we are aware of it. And then if you start looking at near misses and things like that, and again, when I've looked at prosecutions, I would normally go down and I would stand there and watch how many people would slip or have a near miss. Yeah. So I'd gather evidence that way. And if you saw people consistently slipping or water on the floor being trafficked in, I would probably say, well, you know, there's a hazard there, so why don't you actually deal with it? So I think it would. I think it would be a very good example of saying, okay, well, we get an industry change, because then they would actually start looking at their entrances a little bit better.
Yeah.
Because I've walked in, like, with the National Galleries. I've been there, and I've had to penguin walk in after coming out of the rain, and so just very, very gently kind of trying to steady myself until my feet are, not going to slip me over.
Yeah.
And I always wear a slip-rated shoe because that's what I am.
Yeah.
But I think it would. I don't think you need a catastrophic injury to be able to prove that there was a failing there, because it's industry-wide currently. Yeah. We just need it to happen, and then you need a brave enough council, I guess, to really run with it. So.
Yeah. Okay. Keen to move on to some other topics, but just maybe 2 or 3 kind of lessons learned or sort of recommendations or things for people to go away and think about from from your perspective, from that sort of historic enforcement side of things. What are the 2 or 3 things you'd recommend people should do around slips, just to sort of be more on top of it and protect themselves?
I would say don't trust your slip rating, for one, because you can have a very good slip rated floor, but as you said in your talk for RSM, it doesn't matter. Once you start running water contamination or anything else on there, that slip rating is irrelevant now. And you've got to assume that people are going to be trafficking in their own stuff on their shoes and be very worn down and not have the grip. I think monitoring is great, but monitoring without action is pointless. And a lot of sites do that. They monitor. And I think safety signs, just stop trusting a safety sign. And we know that people don't look at them. And so I think I tell most of my clients when I've been in the private realm, and also my current teams, don't trust the safety sign. If you put it out, stand there. Don't isolate that area out and wait until it's actually the risk is gone. If you can't get rid of it, close out the area. I know on my first day at visiting my first sites, one of my OAs, mop the floor, put the sign down, and I watched one of the guys almost slip over, and she went, "But I fixed it." There's a sign there, so don't trust them.
Yeah, I mean, the summing up of the CoOp case by Cornwall Council basically said that the case should serve as a warning that signage alone is not an adequate control, and that floors should either be prevented from becoming slippery, or should be or access should be precluded if they are slippery. So it's very simple. If you've got a floor that you think might be slippery, you either need to do something about it to stop it becoming slippery, or you need to stop people using it. And if you did those things, then we'd all be okay.
Yeah, agree.
Thanks for joining us on the Safety and Risk Success podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit follow and do share on social media. Does anyone you know spring to mind as a great guest, even yourself? If so, please contact us on podcast@slipsafety.co.uk. See you next week for another episode.